Hi, everybody. Welcome to EFF's final fireside chat for our 30th anniversary. I'm so delighted that you could be here. And I am I have to say, I'm kind of giddy with how excited I am about this event because we're going back to the future. We're going to talk to some of the people who were involved in EFF's founding. We're going to hear some stories. I suspect that given the people who are joining us today, it'll be a bit of a Rashomon about EFF's history. Everybody remembers things differently, but it's going to be really great fun. So we have three of the people who helped spur and nurture EFF. As many of you know, probably we were going to have a fourth person. We were going to have Steve Wozniak join us today. And I'm very sad to say that he had to bow out of our event today. He sends his big regrets, and we hope to find a way to schedule an event with him in the future. We were really excited that Steve was going to join us today because he's one of the people who helped support EFF really early on, but isn't as well known for that role. And he recently affirmed to us how proud he was of that early support for EFF, and how important it was going to be to have EFF strong. And in the corner of the tinkerers and the modders and the repairers, especially as we head deeper into the digital age. And if you haven't seen Steve's video on the right to repair, I really recommend it because in it you can see the kind of spirit of the early internet, the makers and the modders and the tinkerers, that really is part of EFF's founding ethos and still a huge part of the community that we support today. So take a look at that and stay tuned. We haven't heard the last from Steve and EFF. So remember, the final part of today's program is for you. Drop your questions into the chat at Twitch at any time. That's EFF.org/livestream. Excuse me, let me say that again. EFF.org/livestream on Twitch. We'll pick them up and we'll respond to as many as we can. And if you're using EFF's privacy badger, I am sorry, you're going to have to give it the permission by shifting the embed.twitch.tv slider and then reload the page. Privacy Badger is a little too over anxious on Twitch. We're working on it, but in the meantime, that'll make sure that your voice is heard. And when we're done today, the stream is going to be available on YouTube. And of course, as all good things are, it'll be available at the Internet Archive. On YouTube, it'll be at EFF's page. And at the archive, it'll be easy to find as well. So tell your friends if they miss this and they want to catch the live stream that they certainly can. Also, please note that as with all EFF events, we have guidelines and codes of conduct. If you go to EFF.org/event expectations, you'll see how we can make sure that we all have a great time today. So thank you very much. This series of live discussions that we've done throughout our 30-year celebration year have looked back at some of the biggest battles in internet history and the effects of the modern web. And joining me today are three people who really, I think it's fair to say, were prescient about that. The first one is our three guests today are Mitch Kapor, John Gilmore, and Esther Dyson. Let's start with Mitch. Mitch is a pioneer of the personal computing industry as both an entrepreneur, an investor, and an advocate for social change. Mitch is always just a little ahead of the curve on things. He was ahead of the curve when he founded EFF, and he's been ahead of the curve at recognizing the need for social justice in the way that we move forward as well. Along with his partner and wife, Frida Kapor-Klein, Mitch invests in startups that close the gap of access, opportunity, and outcome for low-income communities and communities of color, and founders committed to building diverse workforces and inclusive cultures. In 1982, Mitch founded Lotus Development and designed the Lotus 123 spreadsheet, which was the original killer application that made personal computers ubiquitous in the business world. In addition to co-founding EFF in 1990, he's the founding chair of the Mozilla Foundation, which created the Firefox web browser. And the co-chair of the nonprofit Kapor Center in Oakland, California, and serves on the board of SMASH, which is the Summer Math and Science Honors Academy, a 3-year STEM intensive residential college prep course that empowers students to deepen their talents and pursue STEM careers. Mitch is known as saying that genius is not evenly distributed by zip code. Genius is evenly distributed by zip code, but opportunity is not. And the other thing Mitch says that we use all the time at EFF is architecture is policy. And that is one of EFF's founding principles and comes that we still think about today. Next up is EFF co-founder and current board member, John Gilmore. John is an entrepreneur and a civil libertarian, and he's sporting a vintage EFF t-shirt there. He was an early employee of Sun Microsystems, an early open source author, and co-created Cygnus Solution along with EFF, the cypherpunks, the desk cracker that we'll talk a little bit more about later, and the internet's alt-net news groups. He spent 30 years doing programming, hardware, software design, management, and philosophy, philanthropy, and investment. Along with being a board member of EFF, John is on the board of the Unix Association, Code Weavers, and Request. And he spends a lot of time trying to get people to think more about their society they're building, especially around issues around drug policy and attempts to control people's mental states. And John's advocacy on encryption, which we'll also talk about a little later, I think literally changed the world and certainly gave me my first opportunity to do something cool and fun in tech. So welcome, John. And our third person is former EFF chairwoman Esther Dyson. She's currently the chairman of Adventure Holdings and also deeply involved in Wellville. Am I right about that? Did I say it wrong? ED?
So Adventure is basically a website that I use for my email at this point. It was the company I owned for 25 years, but never mind.
Sorry. I must have but anyway.
It's pretty old. Yeah. I realized I didn't send you an updated bio. So
that's all right. Well, we'll talk a little, currently Esther's really working, focusing on health and community health through her project called Wellville. And it's a really awesome thing. So I would love to hear a little bit about that. I think Esther was on one of the first boards of EFF and certainly was chairman of the board through some critical fights. And it's great to have you here today. And of course, just last year, we teamed up with Esther a little bit to try to save .org from being sold down the river. So it's fun to get back in touch as well, because some of these fights, they just keep coming back. So thank you all very much for joining today. I want to start with the founding of EFF because it's so full of rich stories. If folks haven't read John Perry Barlow's A Not Too Brief History of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, that's a really good document to start with. It is, of course, in Barlow's own particular style and his own particular views of the founding of EFF, but it's a real fun read. So, Mitch, I mean, the apocryphal story is that Barlow was sitting on his ranch in Pinedale, Wyoming, and you literally you dropped out of the sky in a plane to talk to him and found the EFF. So where's the truth there? Is that really what happened?
Actually, it is. Well, I'll explain, but first let me say thanks very much for having me. It's important to celebrate these anniversaries, to remember where we all came from, because that helps us understand where we are going. And the spirit of John Perry Barlow looms heavily over this entire event. And I just have to take a moment here to say how much I miss him and how utterly instrumental he was in EFF. So do you want like the 2-minute version of this, not the 10-minute version? I'll give you the medium of the founding. But it all centers on the Well, an early pioneering online system, early virtual community founded by Stuart Brand of Whole Earth Catalog fame and many other things. Circa 1989, going into 1990. They hosted an online hackers conference with Harper's Magazine. And that is where John first ran into some of these teenage hackers who were kids, explorers, getting away with what they can get away with. But it left an impression on him, and it started a dialogue. And then, unrelatedly, or perhaps not, the FBI paid him a visit. And why did the FBI pay him a visit? Because somebody had gone dumpster diving and retrieved a small amount of the source code for the Apple Macintosh, and they had sent copies of it to a number of people, including John, and as it turned out, myself, but that's getting slightly ahead. And the FBI's visit troubled John because, as he said, they were good at things in Wyoming like cattle rustling, but had no idea about cyberspace. And he wrote a piece about it that became widely circulated. And I read it. And I said, oh my God, I had the same frightening experience that these two agents showed up at my door one day, demanding to speak to me. I called my lawyer and said, yeah, you kind of have to speak to them, but if you don't, they'll just get a subpoena. So why don't you? I didn't know anything. I got this thing and I sent it back to Apple. But that was the link between John and me, that we had this, we saw new things going on online, law enforcement starting to step in, unfortunately pretty clueless. And then the arrests started happening. And the Secret Service was busting people, and there was discussed on the well at some length. And it troubled me a lot. And I was flying from Boston, where I lived, to San Francisco to go do something. And I stopped in Pinedale specifically to pay John a visit. We have to do something about this. And that was the birth of the EFF. It was originally to make sure that injustice was not done to some of these kids who were exploring around, but they're not. The stakes were so small then. There was no money involved. There were no state secrets. People's lives were not being ruined, but they were being imprisoned and convicted of felonies. And it was out of conviction that we needed to do something to, and it quickly, and I'll stop, spun into understanding there was a collision going on between the advance of technology and the slow turning of the gears of government. And we realized this was a civil liberties issue of our time, to extend the Bill of Rights into cyberspace. That's the founding. Yeah. And John showed up about 15 minutes later, John Gilmore.
Well, so John, let's pick up.
So he should tell his part.
Perfect segue. So John, pick us up. 15 minutes later.
So on the well a little bit, but my doctor was on the well, and he saw things happening, Mitch and John Perry, and said, I might be interested in this. And so he hooked me up, and I got involved and offered to send money and recruit some supporters like that. I was going back through emails from the time July of 1990 today, and I found one that I sent to the leaders at Sun, trying to convince them to come at us. And I said, what Mitch and Barlow realized as they started to put together the foundation was that it wasn't simply a problem that constitutional lawyers could straighten out. It's an effect of the bumpy interaction of society and computers. Future shopper on the frontier where meet, the law systems are not yet well understood or well defined. We intend to try to define them in the public and law.
Oh, hey, John, I think I'm going to stop you for a second because your audio is really messy. So maybe you could work and we could see if we could clear that up a little bit with Hannah, our lovely off-screen person. So, because this is fascinating and I want to hear every word.
All right.
No, it's still going. Let me switch over to Esther for a second. Yeah, let me switch over to Esther for a second. We'll come back. Thanks. So Esther, you got involved pretty quickly thereafter as I go back through the history. And how did you find out about EFF and decide to get involved? Oh, we got you on mute. That one I think we can take you off.
That's easy. Yes. I hope my sound is working.
Yep.
I knew Mitch mostly through Adventure, which did exist for 25 years. And it was the industry's big conference / newsletter. And Mitch, you'll know this better than I do, that in addition to EFF, there was the commercial internet exchange, because some people at Digital Equipment had sent a sales message over the internet, and a lot of people thought, oh my God, that's so disgusting. And of course we all thought, wow, this is great. You know, it's not just something for scientists and universities, it's actually something for real people kind of living their lives, kind of in the same way that, you know, 30 years later, when you started seeing logos on spaceships that weren't NASA, some of us actually thought it was a good sign. So Mitch started the commercial internet exchange, and I was interested in that. And you know, Barlow was indeed a magnetic figure and was talking about, I mean, to be honest, I loved what he said. I sometimes thought he kind of oversaid it.
You and me both, my friend.
Yeah. But I mean, I don't remember exactly how I got invited to the board and whether it was just because they needed a girl. But anyway, I thought, wow, this is really important stuff. And I want to be involved in, you know, discussing the policy and also helping perhaps to mediate it. And, you know, it seemed like the center of PC Forum was the center of where things were, and this was like kind of the center of where things were heading and the policy side. So I joined the board, and then later on, when they couldn't find a chairman, I stepped in.
You know, there's a long history of EFF getting assigned roles because you came late to meetings. Yes, that's how I got to be general counsel. But we're gonna see if we can get John back on again. But you know, your point about Barlow is a really important one, and one I share. He once actually said that he had me along at a talk so that I could be his hyperbole-ectomy. And I think Mitch, he might have told you the same thing.
No, I told him.
Yeah.
That was my role, and I retired from that role. So thank you for
well, I took it on
over. And at the risk of being mildly pedantic for a moment, Esther, what you're talking about was very real, which was the turnover of the internet from the NSF to the commercial sector, which was a bumpy kind of process. And the commercial internet exchange was this trade association of the early ISPs, UUNet and PSI, that were really trying to promote the commercial development of the internet. But that actually came a little bit later. It may have been your locus of intersection, but I remember when we put it together as an organization in 1990, 1991, I turned to people who I thought were adventurous in spirit and smart and wanted to see the right thing done to be on the board. And you and Stuart Brand and Rob Glazer and a few other people were sort of the early board members.
So perhaps I should come at it from another angle, which also was part of what was happening with me. 1989 was the first time I went to Russia, and I spoke a little bit of Russian. And in the United States, the internet was really cool. It was kind of a consumer thing, and people were talking about wine cellar records and recipes. But in Russia, it actually was far more important, because you could not. I started using email when I was trying to communicate with my friends in Russia, because you could not pick up the phone and call people. You could not send a fax. And I saw how important it could be in a place that did not have other technology. In Russia, the first users were scientists, and then people who were trading stocks, financial types. Whereas in the US, it was much more of a consumer-oriented thing that people didn't believe was going to be serious in business. But in Russia, the implications of what this could do for people who were disconnected, and frankly, who did not have access to media from outside of Russia, was, this whole freedom, spread the truth, all that kind of stuff was much more important in Russia than it was in the US. And I mean, lots has changed, and it's fascinating to see the misinformation. I mean, that I understood too, because I'd seen so much of it in Russia. And we'll get to that later, I'm sure.
Yeah. I think that the early issues that EFF was involved in, many of them we still do today, but of course things have changed over time. And the ones that we still do today are still standing up for free speech, especially for marginalized people all around the world. This issue, that you experienced in Russia is something we hear from people all around the world, that the internet has really made their voice able to be heard. And we still spend a significant amount, it kind of gets lost sometimes in the West, but we still spend a significant amount of time trying to help people get their voices out. I hear an echo, but
it's like half of John's words you can't hear, and the other half you hear twice.
All right, John, let's try again.
Okay. Sure. How's that?
Good if you don't move it.
Okay. Right. So yes, Esther was on the first board, which also included Dave and the Stuart Brand had mentioned as the founder of the Well, and included me. So yeah, I had a long career in computers and no career at all in policy. And so EFF was an attempt to say, well, look at this whole world we're building with computers, and let's not have the people screw up making policies like anything put into a computer is fair government anytime.
Yep. I think that's right. And you hear it in the early things. I went back and watched an early Firing Line episode that Esther and John Perry Barlow did, along with Ira Glasser from the ACLU and some other folks. And
Reid Hoffman and Ariana Huffington, among others.
On the other side, which is interesting. But the point that there was a culture development line that governments in the 90s especially just did not understand, and were mucking around in without really even understanding what they were doing or what was going on online, was really the story of the 90s in a lot of the things that we were doing. The same was true with encryption, in the encryption debate, with the government thinking, well, encryption, that's, a technology that we used to break the Germans' codes and win World War II. And people like John and others saying, this is the way we're going to have privacy and security online. Like, we're both right, but they were coming from very different viewpoints about the technology. And, honestly, both of those debates are still happening right now. It's really not. Oh my gosh. Is the echo? Are you guys hearing the echo too?
Yeah. It's not as bad for you as for John. Keep going.
All right. I'll keep talking. But things have moved over time. And it's not so much that they've moved as in we've solved anything. Sometimes it feels that way. Sometimes things have gotten better. We certainly freed up encryption. If the government had its way in the 90s, none of us would be doing any of this work over encrypted channels. And we really did shift the dynamic there, even though the FBI still wants us all to leave our front doors open, so in case we're criminals, they can come in faster. But and the free speech fights are more complicated now, but they're still there in the primary way that we started talking about them. So let's shift a little bit and talk about I want to talk this next little bit about kind of today, where we are in the world today. And then I want to ask all of you about what the world looks like if we get it right. I have done this throughout the EFF 30th year. I feel like oftentimes in the midst of these policy and legal debates, we've lost a little vision about what the world would like if we get it right. So I want to precede that to you guys. I'm going to ask you that question. But let's talk about today and what things look like today. And this is your note. We're at the half hour, folks. So if you have questions that you want proposed to the panel, please go ahead and put them in the chat on Twitch. Our team will go through them and pick them up, and we'll answer as many of them as we can before we run out of our hour. EFF, as I said, has grown along with the internet, but we've got some new issues as well. And I guess I wanted to ask each of you, what are the issues facing, people who care about civil liberties and digital rights right now, that EFF is either addressing or that you think we ought to address in the current moment, kind of given where we are in the world. I'm going to go to Esther first. I'm going to just kind of mix it up a little bit to see.
Okay. I mean, it was interesting to listen to the firing line debate, which was kind of my prep, and how much the government people, just didn't understand what the thing was. It's not. At the same time, the internet people don't understand that no matter how free you are on the internet, as long as you actually have a front door and someone can come in and attack you, you may be free on the internet, but you're still physically present somewhere and they can come and get you. It's not really a separate place as much as you might think. What's interesting to watch right now is a bunch of, everybody wants the answer. This is acceptable. This is not. These are the rules. But all the stuff we're talking about is really a spectrum. Transparency, the more power you have, the more transparency should be required of you. The less power, fine, be private. But the moment you start acting in public, you start having, your rights impinge on other people's rights and other people's safety. And what we're seeing right now, we have gun control and we have speech and slander and so forth and so on. But we also have this fundamental change of where a person walking down the street may be carrying a concealed weapon, which is a virus. And the issues around privacy, the issues around vaccine passports, people don't seem to get that the issue isn't the passport and the disparity, the poor people are more at risk, poor people are more vulnerable, poor people have more trouble getting vaccines, they're immunocompromised things. But the vaccine passport is not, it's not that. The vaccine passport is just a piece of information. It's not responsible for the disparities that so all these different conversations get conflated into a lot of mishmash. And the one thing the internet has done is it's made it, again, physical borders, sovereign borders, visas, travel, all these things kind of crash into this global internet, but you can't, it goes back to this firing line thing. You want local entities to be able to set their own rules, but they can't set the rules for everybody else.
Yeah,
And,
and it was a problem from the founding on. It's
Yeah.
true.
but at the same time, we now have this third player, which is the Facebooks and and we have the DNA of the internet confronting the metabolism of the always hungry, never enough exponential growth mindset of these companies who simply are focused on creating wealth and selling things, including something like .org, which is not sellable because it's a public asset. And anyway, those are the things that are interesting that are going on right now, to my mind.
Yeah, I would certainly agree that the rise of the internet was kind of created and runs off of protocols and a lot of distributed stuff, and that this platform mentality now is really something that is quite different from the world we had in the 90s. And it's required, at least us at EFF, to really begin to thinking about competition and interoperability and things that kind of help in some ways recreate a more level playing field for people who want to go online or to launch a venture online, whether that's an open source tool or a for-profit business. And it's something that we've just created in the last few years because we felt like if we couldn't address that problem, we couldn't address the privacy problems and the civil liberties problems and the speech problems that are coming as a result of the hegemony of the big companies. I want to. Yeah.
Just one other thing that is really scary, which is these platforms are getting really good at understanding addiction. And, at what point are you kind of infringing on someone's free will if you basically understand them so well that you get them to do things they regret all the time? I mean, my personal feeling is that Robinhood is one of the great disasters of this decade.
Yeah. So thank you. Mitch, where do you see EFF today in the world, and what are the kinds of things that you think, we're doing that you're kind of proud of? Where would you urge us in a little different direction?
Well, you and I have had some interesting conversation about that. Let me see if I can summarize. I think the digital rights perspective needs to broaden, as far as I'm concerned, in order to take on the kinds of injustices and harms that characterize the current age. And you see this in particular, and has been referred to here, the abuses of corporate power, the amplification of misinformation and hatred because it serves the business models of these companies is harmful to the health and safety of large numbers of people in this country who have every right to feel safe. And when conspiracies are being amplified on these platforms, that's a problem. So I would say, yes, being thoughtful about competition and interoperability and the whole, antitrust momentum, that there's a role for an EFF, in that which it is doing. I think there has to be more. I think there has to be, but it gets into politics, and it gets into a zone that rights organizations have always tried to avoid. And I think it's unavoidable, because I don't think you can do the good in the world that you can do if you don't take what are called political stances about what's justice and what's fair. And so if I were on the inside today, I would be trying to have that conversation in the organization about, is our perspective broad enough? Are there things where we really need to take a stand that some people are just not going to like? Can we hold the thing together? I mean, my one last thing I'll say is if I could replay the history of EFF, and where I feel like I could have done a much better job, is in the early days the liberals and the libertarians came together on the issue of digital civil liberties, and we were very effective. But there was a kind of resistance in the organization, and I was in the minority, about feeling that government had a constructive role to play, needed to play a constructive role in securing freedom and liberty and safety. The DNA was very heavily set in favor of a minimal role for government. I was unable to marshal the resources and arguments, or maybe just it wasn't the right time. And EFF, it's had a long history, and maybe someday somebody will write for the history of it. But the reason I mention that now is I think there's a similar moment, and there are choices to be made, and I think it's important to make the right set of choices. And justice requires a pretty broad perspective in expanding what we mean by rights and how we secure them for people, so that we can have a society that is genuinely inclusive of everyone.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly agree that as the internet has grown, the people who need it have grown, the people who rely on it, and the ways in which it's vital have really grown. One of the things I'm proudest of is the work that my colleague Ernesto Falcon has done, trying to get broadband access in the state of California and federally, and specifically around municipal broadband and community broadband efforts, because I think that that's one of the places where we have to try to make sure that we are bringing along, the widest range of people and the widest range of voices. But I completely hear you and respect that, we can definitely always do better. So John, let's go to you. You're on our board right now. And what are the things that EFF is doing right now that you're the proudest of? We didn't get to talk about encryption much because of our technical issues. So.
Right. Well, where we stand now is like, it's kind of the more change, the more they stay the same. Bad people, I mean, I understand Mitch's concern not finding a constructive role for government. But when government was looking clueless about our issue, of course, a reason which is to try to minimize the influence they have. Still seeing that same level of cluelessness with politicians claiming, trying to pass that say you're not allowed to spread misinformation on the internet, and then but when politician lies you're not allowed to them either. This is just a bit clueless. We're seeing the FBI coming around again and saying, well, no, we're not trying to provide a backdoor into every piece of electronic, but we always want to be able to see the plain text of every communication. It's people who have a clear grasp on reality, and or likely it's the old saying about hard for someone to understand your point of view when his job depends on him not understanding you. So I'm very glad that EFF has existed to these issues, and I think we have a long role coming in the future. There's not a clear answer to any of these. There's not an obvious, we'll just do this and then we'll solve it. So it's a muddle, and we have to keep working it through.
Yeah, but the values have stayed largely the same. I agree with Mitch that there's always been a bit of a tension about the role of government. And I agree with John that when your first 10 years are spent trying to convince government agents that you don't have to seize everything that's plugged into the wall, when you have a search engine, you might come at this from a perspective of worry about it. On the other hand, EFF is long advocated for privacy rules that are much, much stronger than we have now. That requires the government to set the floor for our privacy instead of that being left to, individuals clicking through whatever they had around, again, around broadband access, network neutrality. EFF has taken a pretty strong stance for a role of government in creating the spaces for people to be able to innovate, if not making the decisions. So it's always complicated, but I agree that especially in the first 10 years, we were highly skeptical. And I think that skepticism was well earned, and maybe we didn't move past it as fast as some people would have liked us to. I think that's a fair comment as well. We have a few questions, so I want to get to them, but I am going to save the last couple of minutes to ask you, like, what does the world look like if we get it right? But let's ask a couple. We've got one from David Mackey, who asks, what words of advice would you have to the next generation of people who are, looking ahead to the future of the internet? Let's start with Mitch. I saw you go off mute.
So I would encourage looking more broadly than just at the technology. I mean, I know we do that, but I would encourage being less technology centric, because the more I see what has actually happened with the internet, the more I think it is a function of the dysfunction of capitalism. And without fully addressing how capitalism can work better and what's wrong with it, because it's really what is driving, it's where the investment and the dollars go and what gets funded and what gets developed and why and which things. So that, my encouragement would be to bring that much more fully into the picture, to be able to ask questions like, just because you can start a business that's going to make a lot of money, should you really be an American or global hero, or do we want to rethink that?
That's great. Esther?
I would take what Mitch said and kind of extend it even further. I mean, I think Mitch will probably agree, but, first of all, I don't know anybody of the future who's going to be a leader that is not in some way an internet leader. I mean, they might not be building the internet, but they will be using the internet to communicate. They will be using the internet, whether they're for profit or not for profit. I mean, it is part of the infrastructure. And I mean, the biggest problems in the world right now have to do with the resources being distributed unevenly. And those resources start with, we train our AIs. We want to make sure they have no biases. We forget to train our children, and it's not that I want to send all the parents to the training school, though that might be a great idea, but just I work in some of the poorer communities of this country, and half the children are growing up underfed, underloved, undereducated, and they're damaged by the time they become 10 years old. And we can't build a society with that amount of inequity, that amount of damage that it costs. It's human lives, but it's also the cost to the rest of the world. And we need to focus on, God bless it, infrastructure, human capital, as well as, I'm up here in Lake County where it was 104 just 2 hours ago. And where I'm in one of the nicer hotels and the bandwidth works, but all over this county, it's hard to get online. And so, again, people suffer during COVID. So the leaders of the future need to figure out some way to remedy that. And, there may be this world of abundance for a few people, but there's a lot of people missing out. And and the costs are being borne by society. They're being borne by those individuals, but they're also being borne by everybody else. And we need to start thinking both longer term and more broadly about the communities around us, because they are all interconnected.
Yep. We're all interconnected now, that's for sure. Hey, John, what's your advice to the future internet leaders?
Well, I'm with Esther there, and in that a lot of issues to as well as the issues on the internet. Myself, I've spent 20 years on ending war and trying to reduce the arrest rate of Black and brown people, among many other ill effects of the drug war. That's not an EFF thing. I think to be effective, we need to focus on what we're good at. And I would say the internet experiment was a bit of a disaster. It had to grow up very suddenly in the 90s, and it kind of got ossified. Opportunities are still there to continue evolving it. To continue evolving not just what's available on a website, what protocols there are besides the web, invent new things and invent new technologies, and I think a lot the opportunities in the generation are going to come from people who can see beyond paradigm of the internet is an access for five and forget 50 million websites that are and forget those other protocols like voice over IP or email don't matter. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and part of EFF's role is to make sure that part of structure stays open, so that some invent the thing that replaces the world, or that makes a way of communicating email.
Yeah, we got to think beyond the web. I think that is right, and certainly making sure that whatever happens is open for innovation, and for people who who come up with something that none of us thought of before. I mean, I think there's a way in which we try to future-proof our policies and laws so that they can move. That's going to need to move beyond. Certainly the 5 big companies that control everything today, but even beyond the things that we're thinking about and talking about today. The next question is more focused on EFF. What are the ways in which EFF, this is from, I'm going to say it wrong, PMOSEC. In what ways is EFF important today that you did not expect in the organization's early years? John, we're still having trouble with your audio, but maybe I'll go to Mitch first.
Well, look, I certainly didn't anticipate, nor do I think most of the other folks early on anticipated that the scale and centrality of the internet and the way things would be dependent on it. The fact that the stakes are so much higher today because it affects everybody in every way is just, I think, not, it's just hard to imagine. I think the human imagination in general doesn't work if you're trying to think 6 or 7 orders of magnitude larger. Or maybe there are a small number of geniuses for whom that, is the case. And so, sort of had we known, I think would have paid a lot more attention to security in the early days, which is just sort of, most people were pretty nice and it was friendly and open. It came out of academia and the research world, and sort of very casual decisions, have had enormously consequential and not great effects that, and can't really be undone. Can only be sort of incrementally fixed, patched, kind of, and so, yeah.
Oh, I think that is right. Esther?
The punchline is that the stakes with which EFF, is involved and the difference that can make is global. That's not exactly, we thought it was important, but more, in some sense, on principle and wanting to do the right thing. And today, again, EFF is important because everything that it touches just is so consequential.
Yep. Yeah.
I guess the one thing we didn't really understand perhaps is that the problem with the internet is the people on it. It's not the internet. And, eventually all the people are on it. And one problem is the people who can't get on it by virtue of income or, depending on where they live, even a government that doesn't want people to communicate, or they're not educated, money, whatever. But fundamentally, if you got rid of the people, the internet works fine. It's the people on it that need to be, if not, again, this issue about local regulation versus universal, how the different parts fit together, what you do about misinformation. Forget porn. Misinformation is kind of causes active harm, and again, it's much more like a virus.
Yeah.
In a sense, I like the notion of you look for the metabolism, which is the business models that end up being cancerous,
Mhm.
rather than looking for the the particular strings of text or images or something. It's those business models that really cause most of the trouble.
Yeah. I think it's really true that I think there was a dream that Barlow had that we could start this new place that would be better than the place we left behind, right? That's his famous quote.
Yeah.
And I think that the reality is we brought all of society's ills with us. And so if we want to make the internet a better place, we have to make society a better place at some basic level. And the protocols can help us, but they're not going to solve it. John?
And we need to make sure that Elon Musk understands the same problem is going to happen with Mars.
I'm not sure we can leave the planet either and leave the problems behind, as long as humans are going. That may be fair. John?
Right. Well, one thing we didn't understand in the early years is that copyright was going to be an issue to care about. And John Perry figured that out, and the first to write about it in Wired. Had to drag us along a bit to work on it at all. But now it's a major what we do as copy information is really how networks work. So I don't know that we've really identified new as big as copyright. Maybe antitrust is another one that we didn't think we'd have to get involved in, and maybe now we do.
Yeah, I think those are two of them. I think patents as well is something that, of course, Mitch and our current board chair, Pam Samuelson, identified a long time ago as an issue that we then have launched projects and continue to work on as well. So that's another one that comes to mind. So we only have a few minutes left. So I want to do a kind of a lightning round and ask each of you, so what does the world look like if we get this right? How does our, I take your point that the digital world, the offline and the online world are increasingly difficult to separate, but we're here at EFF. So what does the digital world look like if we get it right? Let me start with you, Esther.
I sort of question the premise that there's an end state. And what we need to do in a sense is develop a grammar for changing the rules, a constitution rather than a static set of regulations, because there's things continue to evolve, and both the problems and the solutions keep moving dynamically. I do think, as I said earlier, if we have a well-educated population that is both literate and knows how to think, and also is mentally healthy and happy, not life require struggle. It would be really boring if it didn't have it. But we need to figure out how to evolve and change rather than, we need to keep going west rather than going to the North Pole. You know, it's just, we keep moving forward, adjusting, changing, having proper ways of doing that. And that's very vague, but that's the reality of it.
Well, I think that's really right. Yeah.
You know, and frankly, I hope, you know, that global warming or, you know, evolving viruses don't just kind of stop the whole experiment in the middle. But, you know, I always used to say if there was a nuclear explosion, after the explosion was over, it would sort of, some things would become easier because it would just be clear what you needed to fix, and you sort of go around and pick up the pieces. And,
Yeah.
you know, my hope is that as this COVID thing gets to some point where we can start picking up pieces, we'll start putting them together in a better way, you know, focusing on education, focusing on racial disparities and economics and people's need for meaning and dignified work and stuff like that. And if we do that, you know, it'll be on the internet, it'll be in real life, and it will be much better.
Great. Thanks. John?
Let's see. I grew up as kind of a low class kid in a small town, and my way of getting out of was the library. Right. That was the institution that previous generation had created to help people overcome their inhibition and become like a full the world. I think we have in many ways supplanted that with the internet. We've created our own infrastructure for helping people in strangers where they don't have very many friends, and through people who understand them, to find their own need, to find their own interesting work, and to make their way in making the world a better place. I think the challenge in this generation is tolerance, is the ability to live with we disagree with the generation that we think is wrong, or gens who we think malevolent, or countries who we have been prized to think are bad people. I think the challenge is not now that we have full to all information in the world, now we have to develop some judgment about what to do, and not just down the people disagree with, but trying to find mutual understanding.
So our good future, we have mutual understanding and access to information for everyone, regardless of where they are. I'm here. Mitch?
Well, I have a more modest goal. I'm going to answer a slightly different question. How can we be less wrong? What would things be like if we were less wrong? And I would say, if we could stop thinking of technology as some sort of autonomous force for good, that would be a start. And by analogy, in America, and I know not everybody on this stream is American, and I'm aware of that, but it's where we are. There's a big rethink going on in certain quarters, because we understand that the values that we hold dear should be taken more as aspirational than a reality. Liberty and justice for all. But until and unless we hold up a mirror to ourselves to say, well, how is it that we are actually not living those ideals, and that many people are not included and do not have the opportunity and do not have justice? That's where it starts to change things. If you hold up a mirror and ask, what are we doing and what can we do differently? How do we take responsibility for the world that we have created, especially those of us who have any degree of power and privilege. And I would say the same thing in the technology world, that a process of sometimes uncomfortable self-examination, I think is actually going to be the thing that can make a difference in making things less wrong and less bad. And there's no shortage of places to start on the issues that EFF is grappling with.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. I love how two of the three of you reframed my question. I think that's a good indicator of the talent we have here.
Just like every EFF board meeting I was ever involved with.
Well, we've run out of our hour. This has been fascinating. I could do this for another 2 or 3, but I really want to thank Mitch and Esther and John for joining us today, and John for braving all the technical problems.
Yeah.
I want to thank all of you for watching, and EFF supporters and members all around the world. You help make things like this possible, but more importantly, all the work we do every day, and the 85 people here who someday again may be here on Eddy Street in San Francisco, and all around the world working on this. I want to give a special shout out to Hannah Diaz, Aaron Jew, and Christian Romero for their support for this event on the back end. EFF has led the charge for privacy-free expression and innovation for the past 30 years. We're just getting started. As you can tell, we have a very long history already, but I feel like we really are just getting started in some ways. If you think that it's important to have EFF out there standing strong for your rights and the rights of people who have no voice online, please join us. We work for tips, and we stand on the shoulders of giants. So please join with us. So we also have really cool swag if you join. So there's benefits as well. But I hope that you'll continue these conversations about freedom and technology and the better world offline with your friends. And thanks again for joining us. And happy birthday, EFF.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. Great to see all of you.
Yeah.
Great to see you, and shout out to John Perry Barlow, Solo, Sony, Cyberspace.
Yep.
Yeah. And IRL sometime soon. Thank you.